Hi, everybody. I'm Nicholas Brook from PFMD, and I just would like to offer a warm welcome to all of you and to joining as I speak. So it's the session about how to connect patients to digital health at the Patient Engagement Open Forum. The point of the Open Forum is to bring all stakeholders together to actually look at our health systems and how patient-centered they are and what we can do to make it better. And that's exactly what we're gonna do today together. One of the goal of the session is when we talk about digital, we talk about many aspects, and I will set the scene a bit further. But one of the points we want to do today is to actually engage you, the audience, to understand what we should be doing together. What are the key issues? What are the priorities? What are the problems that we want to solve when it comes to patient engagement in digital health? So before we get there, I just would like to do some housekeeping rules. And so next slide, please. We will record the session and we expect over 100 people. So it's a principle of co-creation. So we will leave all channels open, the chat and the Q&A. We will have our 4 speakers speaking, and you will be able to ask your question and comment in written. We'll have more time for discussion a little bit later, but also get your input in terms of from what you have heard, what you want to discuss, and how you would like to address things moving forward. You will be muted. Yes, all the questions, even if we don't have time to take them during the day today, we will follow up on these questions later on as we have a good 90 minutes, but you will see it's a pretty rich discussion we'll have. So 90 minutes might feel very short. Now, if we can get to next slides, I will briefly set the scene because what are we talking when we talk about digital health? So it's a field which is moving very, very fast, and every day we hear news about how it accelerates research, how it manages more and more complex issues, how it provides new solutions and support for patients, caregivers, and HCPs, how it allows better informed decisions for patients, HCPs, and the various stakeholders of health systems, how it connects different aspects of health systems together while they were not connected before, and how it offers all sorts of remote options when we need it, as we have seen with remote clinical trial, for example, in the last 12 months. So we hear breakthrough stories everywhere, very often at scale, because digital really allows us to do things at scales. And still, there is plenty of potential for innovation and better health outcomes. So the potential remains completely unlimited. It's everywhere to the point that there is no such thing as digital health. There is just health in digital age. However, there is all these positive aspects, but there are also some key questions, pending question. Are we doing it right? How efficient is the current model? How systematic are we? What gaps and who do we leave behind? How fragmented and not digital minded are we? What are good practices? What are bad practices in digital health? Are we even patient-centered? And how well? Can we trust digital health? I ask all these questions, and the reason is because actually the answers to this question today are far from satisfying. And today we want to look at it and start shape an agenda on digital health where we can try to solve and improve all these aspects. In the true spirit of the Patient Engagement Open Forum, I'm particularly happy, and if we can go to the next slide, I'm particularly happy to introduce you to 4 speakers. The first one, Andrea Downing, a patient advocate, and security research from the Valley. Charles Stewart, combining at least 3 hats, a caregiver, the genetic scientist, and patient advocacy function in his organization Congenica. Hadley Clark, caregiver, and bringing a health system perspective as director at Faster Cures. And Jan Geisler, patient advocate, aiming to make digital health meaningful for patients too. And so you will see very diverse perspective, diverse from a function point of view, diverse from a geographic point of view, but still a lot of commonalities in terms of the issue. Even if we have a different context, the commonalities are quite important. So let's get started with Andrea and why we start with her. So it's very important because in the audience even yesterday, and I hear that all year long, diversity and inclusion are key issues for our community. However, when it comes to digital, it's not necessarily the case. And as a caregiver, I understood quite recently that mass discrimination was actually a result of the current digital system. And unfortunately, I myself took an active role in this and actually played against the interest of my son as caregiver in the long run. And you will understand a bit more why later on. And so by extension, I realize how we, all of us, not only me, and our organizations are unconsciously letting that happen every day. So more than me, actually, the best person to talk about that is Andrea. And because of a time difference issue, she's not physically with us today, but she has recorded a video that I'm really happy to present for you now. So please open the video for Andrea and share it with our audience.
Hello, everyone. My name is Andrea Downing, and I am a security researcher. I am very honored today to speak at the Patient Engagement Open Forum. Sorry I can't be there in person due to time zones, but I'm very committed to participate in this wonderful event and very glad to be here. So, today I'm going to talk about three things. The first is I'm going to share a little bit about my e-patient story. I'm going to talk about why we need to level up the protection of patients' privacy and cybersecurity through representation. And the third thing I'm going to give is a call to arms by talking about the role of patients and representatives as we think about this brave new world of technologies and digital health. So let me begin with my story. In all of the places my genome could have gone right and could have gone wrong, my future changed 15 years ago when I found out that I had a BRCA1 mutation. What that meant was I had an incredibly high risk of breast and ovarian cancer. A genetic counselor sat me down and basically told me my future. They told me that I had an 87% chance of developing breast cancer and up to a 60% chance of developing ovarian cancer in my lifetime. This is me right after my bilateral mastectomy. And it was one of the most life changing experiences and hardest decisions I ever had to make. And I had to make that decision through data, the data that we had at the time. And one of the things I've learned is that data about populations is something that changes. Well, I'm very well grounded in the decision that I had to make. There are people out there with genetic mutations that don't have good data from which to make decisions. And hopefully that will evolve over time. Throughout my experience as a pre-viver, I also struggled. You have to keep in mind back in 2005 when I found out that I carried this BRCA mutation, I was not even able to talk to my own family and have them understand the decisions that I faced. And as it turns out, zooming out to the broader community, many women in the hereditary cancer community also fell through the medical cracks over time, and they continue to do so when we don't have access to the care or access to the tools that we need to make informed decisions about our bodies. And I want to point you to this really great article in the LA Times, which talks about this phenomenon of why pre-vivers and cancer survivors often, when we fall through the medical cracks or healthcare doesn't adapt as rapidly as we are, we go to social media to find each other. And that's not only true for my community, the broader cancer community, it's true for rare diseases, it's true for many patient communities out there. So as somebody who's lived in this world of digital health for about 8 years as an advocate, my first foray into advocacy or activism was a case that went to the United States Supreme Court about whether human genes had been patented. So here I am on the steps of the Supreme Court. I was a spokesperson for one of the plaintiffs in the case, Breast Cancer Action. And the question in this case was whether BRCA 1 and 2 and the diagnostic testing company that held a patent on my genes was allowed to patent something that is part of the human genome. Before this case, up to 40% of the human genome had been patented. And after this case, when the patents on BRCA 1 and 2 were overturned, it really opened the floodgates to new opportunities, new innovations in genetics. It also created a bit of a Wild West situation where there are a lot of companies out there that over the past few years have kind of peddled, snake oil or bad options for genetic testing. And we have to bridge the genetic literacy divide as a community in order to make informed decisions. Well, my story took an interesting turn, I'll tell you, in 2018. As I said, we had a lot of groups on social media and continue to have those. And if everybody remembers, in spring of 2018, Cambridge Analytica made the headlines. And that was basically a breach in Facebook where through digital quizzes, a company called Cambridge Analytica was allowed to scrape the digital profiles of people on Facebook. Well, I asked myself a simple question at the time. And that question was, what are the privacy implications of having a health support group on Facebook? Now, I should tell you I have a background in technology. I am not just a patient advocate. I started my career in Silicon Valley, and I'm a little bit of a nerd. I'm passionate about the ideas of data sharing and innovation, data driving innovation. But this was a moment in time that really changed things, not only for me, but other communities, when we took a step back and realized that our data can also cause harm. So what happens, basically, I found myself falling down a cybersecurity rabbit hole. I found a vulnerability in Facebook's group architecture, and we called the vulnerability Sick Girl. And that was an acronym for Strict Inclusion Criteria Group Reverse Lookup. And basically, it was a way for me as an attacker outside of a support group to scrape the full list, the real names of people, PHI, i.e. attaching a clinical fact about a person without even being a part of the group. A congressional inquiry ensued where I guess maybe third time Zuckerberg has gone in front of Congress to ask questions. There were questions with the Committee on Energy and Commerce specifically about this issue. And following that, there was a $5 billion settlement. But unfortunately, Facebook's health privacy problems were not directly addressed in this settlement. And it's still something that is ongoing. Well, what is the harm? I'm going to give a couple of examples, but there are many. One of the harms is when we seek to engage on social media and data here in the United States pertaining to health isn't protected by a national health privacy law. Well, that enables mass discrimination where health insurers or employers can vacuum up details about you on social media, and they can use those data profiles to make decisions about you without your knowledge or consent. And so that's kind of the backstory. I know this is quite a bit of backdrop, but it brings me to my second part of this. So So what does this bring us, and what is happening next? And I kind of think of this world in digital health as a coming tsunami. You know, we have so much to do to recognize the value and the promise of digital health. But why do we need to level up the protections of patient privacy and cybersecurity? Well, the stakes are really high, not just in Silicon Valley, where things are not protected by HIPAA, but you have to keep in mind that inside a HIPAA covered entity here in the United States, healthcare organizations are becoming particularly vulnerable to data breaches. In fact, in 2019, 41 million patient records were hacked alone here in the United States. Healthcare organizations are quickly becoming a top target for cyber criminals due to the lucrative nature of healthcare records. You have to keep in mind when a health data breach happens, unlike a financial data breach, those are facts about you that are leaked that cannot change, depending on how complete the record is. Um, and that's, keep in mind, nearly 50 times higher than the standard price on the black market for credit cards or financial information, which is all something you can change about yourself. Our health is inherently linked to our digital identity. It's not something that we can change. And it's something that can be weaponized against people. So this brings me to my third point. What is the role of patients and or representatives as we think about this coming tsunami, as we think about new technologies like genomics, machine learning, blockchain, deepfakes, disinformation? Well, we've only really hit the tip of the iceberg. I hope that my experience can teach a broader community that when we are not part of the design of digital health technologies and are vulnerable as people affected, we are subject to harm. As we plow forward in this brave new world, we want to recognize the promise of data and the power that it can bring to affect change. We also have a huge responsibility with that power, a responsibility to represent the people who are directly affected by these technologies, the people who can be harmed if something goes wrong. I also hope what my story teaches is that the tech companies that are in place today and the models that we have today have to shift fundamentally. We cannot, as communities or as patients, have data about us owned as property and bought and sold to shareholders instead of thinking of us as representatives. We have a responsibility to care for our digital selves when technology has the power to both save lives and kill people. I've learned the hard way as just one technology, social media, can have an incredible impact on my own community, on my life, and on people that I may never meet. And I hope that the work we've done in privacy and cybersecurity over the past few years has at least protected some of us. My call to arms is this. I challenge you to think about data and technology as something different that represents us. The way I like to say this is no aggregation without representation. We have a responsibility to self-govern. I want a future where my family and my children aren't just thought of as users, but we're thought of as humans with rights. And privacy is a human right. We are part of the design and part of the solution as patients. And we can represent ourselves in the future that we want to create. I hope you'll take up this call to arms with me, and thank you.
So it's really great that she could record this video with us. She might join us for the FAQ a little bit later. But so yes, a call to arms is how she would put it, and the role of patients that needs to have a role in digital health. A key insight from Andrea there. And so you please don't hesitate to ask questions in the Q&A or to make comments in the chat. We have Michael Mittelman with us in the discussion today. He's actually a colleague of Andrea and partner in crime as well, and actually can address all the questions about security and privacy linked to the work that they have done together. So if we can go back to the slides, I'd like to introduce Charles Stewart, and actually from a patient perspective, I would like to move to him because, as mentioned earlier, he has the three perspectives: the researcher one, the caregiver, and also the patient advocacy role in his organization. And actually, with his work in genetic research, it's actually very interesting to combine the three perspectives in one person. So, Charles, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, I'm guessing you can hear me because no one said anything to the contrary. So yes, so my name is Charlie Stewart, and I've spent my career working on the human genome. 27 years, in fact, I've been working on the human genome on the Wellcome Genome Campus near Cambridge in the United Kingdom. And 22 of those years, I was an academic at the Wellcome Sanger Institute. And the Wellcome Sanger Institute is best known for generating around 1/3 of the human genome, which was the largest proportion of any institute around the world. I did my PhD at the Sanger Institute and led the initial human chromosome 10 analysis, which was published in Nature back in 2004. More recently, I've been leading an international collaboration that's looking at genes that are associated with sort of early onset and very severe epilepsies in children. And currently I'm the patient advocacy engagement lead at Congenica, which is also based at the Wellcome Genome Campus. I'll explain a little bit more about what they do in a minute. But I think most importantly, I'm the father of a family that is affected by severe neurological diseases. So Congenica is, as I said, situated on the Wellcome Genome Campus, and we're a digital health company that has essentially developed a world-leading clinical decision support software system that allows the analysis of complex genomic data, but specifically in the context of rare diseases. And essentially, we help to support healthcare professionals to transform health and wellness for patients more quickly and more accurately than has essentially ever been done. And we are the exclusive clinical decision support partner for the NHS Genomic Medicine Service. So rare diseases, we believe there are at least 7,000 rare diseases, and a rare disease is a disorder that affects fewer than 1 in 2,000 people. But having read the literature recently in a recent Nature paper, we believe there are at least 10,000 or more rare diseases. So collectively, rare diseases aren't actually that rare at all. And in fact, one in 17 people around the world will develop a rare disease at some point in their lives. And this means there are roughly 400 million people around the world who have a rare disease. And to put this into context, if this was a country, it would be the third, this population was a country, sorry, then this would be the third largest country behind China and India. And unfortunately, rare diseases affect children much more than adults. And sadly, 30% of sick children with a rare disease never reach their 5th birthday, We believe at least 80% of rare diseases have a genome or a genetic origin or susceptibility, and 95% of rare diseases have no drug treatment at all. And this is a reason why projects such as the Developing Deciphering Developmental Disorders study and the 100,000 Genomes project was set up. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about my daughter, Imogen. And this is a picture of her on the Born website. And Born is a charity based in London that raises awareness and raises funds to investigate the reasons why some children are born prematurely. So Imogen was born August 2012 at around 29 weeks, and she spent 1 month on intensive care. She came home and she was fine. And then it was sort of 6-7 months later, we noticed there was something really quite troubling about her. She had stopped doing certain things like smiling or taking an interest in her surroundings. And she became sort of withdrawn. And at certain times of the day, she became very, very agitated and angry and upset. And then in April of 2013, we noticed this started to happen. I don't know if you can see her arms fly up in the air and her head turn. And then she cries, and then she does sort of a staring motion and her arms fold. They go up in the air. And then that continues. And that continues on for about 2 to 3 minutes, maybe a little bit longer. So we'd been previously taken her to see our GP, and she'd suggested that Imogen had a gastrointestinal reflux and prescribed her with Gaviscon, which is a type of sort of a very common medication that people take for indigestion or whatever. But it was clear that there was something very wrong. And after we'd filmed Imogen, we took her to our local hospital in Cambridge, a hospital called Advocacy, where she was just diagnosed with a very, very severe type of epilepsy called West syndrome. And West syndrome, every time you have a seizure, it essentially causes catastrophic brain damage. And the more you seize, the more brain damage occurs. And obviously, if you can't control the seizures, then there's a very, very poor outcome or outlook for the child. But luckily for us, our clinician was enrolled and very much involved with a clinical study that was looking at West syndrome, and the medication he gave her actually stopped her seizures within 24 hours. So she was able to start developing again, although not at the same rate as a normal child, but she had at least stopped her seizures. So a couple of years later, she had just been diagnosed with cerebral palsy. And we'd had a night vision camera installed in her bedroom. And it was very lucky that we had, because we noticed just after she'd gone to bed, gone to sleep, so about half an hour later, some very curious movements in her cot. We couldn't really hear anything, but when we went up to see her, she was doing this.
That's correct, yes.
This is actually me on the phone to the...
Yes, we're number 4 on the right. We're cream coloured.
But as you can see,
yeah.
It's a very, very different type of
so
seizure.
Do you want to go with you, or do you want to go on your own?
Different,
and
it progressively gets worse and worse. The movements become more and more pronounced. But generally, when someone has a seizure, they tend to come out of it after 5 or 10 minutes. But my daughter here, she's going through something called status epilepticus, and that's when your seizure doesn't stop. And this is really very, very severe. If you can't stop this, obviously, if the child had been in bed all night, if Bridget had been in bed all night having the seizure, it's very likely she would have died. Luckily, the ambulance turned up within about 5 minutes, and they were able to stop her seizures. But had it not been for that night vision camera, it's very likely she would have died that night. So epilepsy is unpredictable. It has many forms. It can look very different, and it can actually progress during life. You can go from, as you can see from Imogen there, you know, the seizures will change in some cases over time. So obviously, being a having had a background in genomics, I was very keen to look for any answers that her genome might have for us to understand why she's different. And there have been a number of times during our battle with her epilepsy when people have said to me, well, why do you want a genomic diagnosis? What difference is it going to make? And I would say that's a fair question, but I would say that there are many reasons why. So genomics has the potential to avoid invasive procedures. If you're able to get a genomic diagnosis, you can prevent the need for having to do MRIs or general anesthetics for various other bits and pieces. And even when there's currently no disease modification therapy available, a genomic diagnosis can help inform on appropriate recurrence counselling for parents. How the disease might progress, as well as allowing families to meet other families, as we've just heard in the previous talk, through social media groups. And grouping together, patients can help drive research for therapies. And I think also what's very important, and studies have shown this, that a genomic diagnosis can actually bring about psychological closure. The voice of the parent is incredibly powerful, and I will explain that a little bit later. Anyway, so Imogen was enrolled into the UK 100,000 Genomes Project, a study that was looking at people who had rare disease and cancer. And it was initiated by the ex-Prime Minister of the UK, David Cameron. And it was initiated because of the struggle that David Cameron had with his son. And this is his son on the right-hand side here. His son, Ivan, was born with a very severe type of epilepsy called Ohtahara syndrome. It's a very similar type of epilepsy to that of my daughter. He also had severe cerebral palsy, and sadly, he died at around the age of 6. And it was because of this that ultimately the 100,000 Genomes Project was set up in the United Kingdom. So we got our 100,000 Genomes report back literally 1 minute before my son's 12-week scan. As you can see here, nothing was found. Nothing was found to explain why Imogen had her troubles. So I suppose it was good to know it's not one of the terrible disorders already known about by clinicians, but it was kind of disheartening to have any answers for Imogen's challenges. And of course, one of the things that is important to remember about genomics is to keep looking at the genome, from time to time. As new data becomes available and new techniques, perhaps such as long read sequencing, become available. And this is actually something that Genomics England, the 100,000 Genomes Project, is doing. So if you don't find a result at first, you go back and look again in a couple of years or a year later. So this is my son, Jasper. He was born at 28 weeks. And he was on intensive care for 2 months. And it wasn't until we were about to go home literally a week before Christmas in 2017, that we were given the devastating news that Jasper had suffered severe brain damage during birth. He'd been starved of oxygen, parts of his brain had died, and as they die, they sort of leave holes and then fill back up with liquid. And it was this liquid which the ultrasound picked up. And we were told that he was very likely to have severe problems during his life. But he was then put onto another genome study at Cambridge University, but again, nothing was found. So some people might think it's not genetic, but I am very much of the opinion, as are clinicians, that it is, that both their problems are genetic in cause. We just haven't found those bits of the genome which are likely to be responsible. So these are some of the bits of equipment that we have to help make our life more manageable. We have a couple of manual wheelchairs. We have a couple of power chairs. The green power chair was given to us by a charity. It actually cost around 25,000 euros, which is a huge amount of money. But of course, these things are not needed, thankfully not needed by people very much, but it means that for a parent, they're enormously expensive. So this is a picture of Imogen's bedroom. We can see a night vision camera to monitor her seizures. We've got an anti-suffocation pillow because, of course, one way that people die from a seizure is actually once a seizure starts and they're face down, they can suffocate. It's a power-adjusted hospital bed that allows it to go up and down to make getting in and out easier for us. They have toileting and shower chairs. have activity in meal chairs, and they also have standing frames. Of course, neither children can stand, and sadly my son doesn't speak. We have to generate that sort of standing ability through supported means. So the importance of the patient voice. Well, I think this picture here actually describes quite nicely. So are we looking at a picture of a cat in a box? He prefers the cardboard box because the cat cushion is not what he was wanting. It was not designed for what the cat wanted. This often happens when companies set about designing something, never really consider what it is that the patient wants. Or is it that the cat doesn't actually know that cat seat is for him? Maybe that the patient isn't aware of what is out there, what it is that can be provided to them. And just looking back at this quote on the right hand side, clinicians even back in sort of the 19th century were saying how important it is to include the patient's voice in everything that's done. And the patient voice is very powerful. I've listed 3 friends here. So Foray, which is run by a guy called Luke Rosen. He has a child with a mutation in the gene Foray, but he's set up an incredible advocacy support website, and he's driving research. He's actually looking at sort of clinical trials. He's got mouse models, he's got zebrafish models, and he works very closely with this lady on the right, an absolutely incredibly wonderful, lovely lady. I know her quite well, Wendy Chung. So she works with him on KIF1A, but she's also involved with the Champ One support group, is run by a guy called Jeff D'Angelo, and he too has done an amazing thing. He is I think he was a PE teacher, whereas Luke was an actor. They've come with no genomic background whatsoever and have done incredible things to really drive research. And in fact, my friend Alison Watson from the Ring 20 chromosome support group has actually managed to get a project going with Illumina, and has been up in front of the FDA talking to them about repurposing drugs for different types of epilepsy. And patient advisory groups are there to, they're there to help make sure that the data for these projects is used correctly and appropriately. And the 100,000 Genomes, or Genomics England, actually have a specific participant panel that is the heart of everything they do. And I'm a member of that group, and that everything really has to be rubber stamped by the patients. People want to come and look at the 100,000 genomes data. As you can imagine, it's massively important for industry and pharma. But we have a say in whether they're allowed to do things with it that we think are unethical. They wouldn't be allowed to do so. And likewise, there's a similar thing at the Simon Searchlight group in the United States, which is doing a big study into autism. And trust, of course, is absolutely essential for the patient. And here is a tweet from Chris Wigley, who's the CEO of Genomics England. Trust is existential for them. And that's absolutely how it should be. Once you lose trust, it's very, very difficult to get it back again. And and this is the patient advisory group on the left, who are holding Congenicus feet to the fire to make sure that everything we do has the patient at the center of it. So thank you very much for listening. I'd just like to acknowledge the following people. This is me and my family, my contact details if you're interested. And also just a little shout out to this little charity in London, Hope. They support families who are going through very tough times with epilepsy, and I've recently become their patron. Thank you. I would now like to introduce my colleague, Hadley Clark.
Thank you, Charlie. Much appreciated. So hello, everyone. So as my slides are coming up, I just wanted to get started with thinking about what a trusted health data sharing ecosystem would look like. And I'd like to sort of take us back to the early 2000s, where Amazon was actually an online bookseller, Facebook was a virtual yearbook platform connecting college students, and Apple launched its first iPhone. So next slide, please. So most of us, I feel like, would not have predicted that these companies and many others like them in the technology space would actually enter the healthcare market. More and more companies now outside of traditional healthcare organizations, specifically technology companies, are now working with what we call patient-generated health data. They are collecting, aggregating, analyzing, and sharing, and in many cases, even selling our health data. And although these companies, like those that make up big tech, or have the resources and also the much needed experience to solve many problems that have plagued the digital health space for many years, their practices are heavily criticized, as we've learned from Andrea's presentation. More often than not, these practices are developed without patients and don't align with patients' best interests. Next slide. So often whenever I speak about specifically big tech and also technologies companies' influence in the healthcare space, I get a lot of disbelief because so many feel that there are other more powerful players in the space. But even if you don't necessarily use a product directly developed by one of the big tech companies, their influence is undeniable, as demonstrated by this slide. For those of you that may have doubts about the power at play within healthcare, here's an illustration from Capital IQ. I think it does a really great job at demonstrating the financial disparity even between companies considered big tech and what we also consider big pharma. It's relatively mind-boggling. So yes, I think it is very safe to say that what we need to do is consider the role that they have in healthcare, especially their influence in the digital health space and the collection and use of our health data. Next slide. So with the entrance of traditional technology companies entering the health space, it actually has created new forms of health data. So data collected from outside of the clinic or traditional clinical trials. And we've seen this with genetic testing companies that have direct-to-consumer models, as well as organizations like Walmart and Amazon with products that are developed and provided directly to consumers or patients. And this also is kind of complicated by the fact that the concept of the quantified self, or people who are obsessed with all kinds of personal tracking devices and collecting and analyzing their own data points, has kind of fueled this booming wearable device industry. So then the question becomes, what is the benefit for the patient with these new modalities of data tracking and the collection by third parties, and relatively, like, what's the impact here? Next slide. So in a previous study at Faster Cures, a center of the Milken Institute, we asked patients about this new dynamic of data collection by third parties, predominantly in the technology company space. And what we found was that patients, although are overwhelmingly willing to share their health data in the advancement of research or to improve the care of others, we identified that there was a huge barrier, just as Charlie and Andrea alluded to, which was trust. We found that patients trust their clinicians, their providers, and their care teams, but the further and further removed their data is from that care team, especially if they don't know how or why their data is being used, they become distrustful and skeptical. So even though many of these apps and third-party digital platforms are developed with good intention, and many of these organizations are well-positioned with their resources to solve a lot of these age-old digital health problems, such as interoperability and communication and access, patients have largely come to mistrust those companies that collect and use their data. And lack of trust further alienates patients from meaningful engagement with their health data and any future research efforts that could stem from it. Next slide. So here's a wonderful flowchart created by our friends at GoInvo that illustrates the life cycle of someone's health data as a result, in this case, a doctor's office visit with lab tests or blood tests. And through our work at Faster Cures, we learned that the majority of patients truly don't know what is considered health data, nor are patients actually aware of how or why their data can be used. And we realize that this issue of health data literacy is intimately connected to the idea of trust. We can't promote trust without transparency and understanding of how data is being used. Next slide. So how do we address that health literacy issue? So a couple years ago, Faster Cures actually received funding from Foray to develop tools that would educate patients about the basics of health data, such as where their data comes from, as well as how it's used. And we conducted research including over 700 patient surveys, as well as some additional key stakeholder interviews, and ultimately developed an online prototype housing open source educational tools for anyone wishing to educate patients about health data. Next slide. So as you see from this slide, the models that were developed in the Health Data Basics platform fell into two different categories. The tools that were available were developed, the first being designs for in-clinic or waiting room installation in the form of posters, brochures, handouts for patients or caregivers, which you see on the right. This is a loose illustration of sort of the tangled pathway that someone's health data travels. And then the second offered was a sort of an educational plugin for seamless integration into existing wellness apps, patient portals, or websites. So again, an online site with open source data and tools of pre-developed, pre-illustrated graphics for people to easily sort of drop into their platforms. Next slide. So how do we actually create the ideal future state of this sort of trusted data ecosystem, knowing what we know now, that trust is a key component, health literacy is a key component? So first, through resources like Health Data Basics and others, patients ultimately need to understand what health data is, how it can be used to ultimately gain access, and finally control of their health data, as Andrea alluded to. Second, we need to foster a collaborative environment where patients, researchers, and these new technology companies entering the space actually work together to ensure that patients reap the benefit from contributing their data through tracking and updates, and if and where possible, achieve real-time feedback. So patients should know where their data is, how it's being used, and what insights are derived. And then also, this needs to lead to the establishment of shared values through consensus-based guidelines. There should be strong and clear protections for health data, including transparency and patient control. Most organizations right now have their own self-governance models. It leads to a very fragmented, confusing system and lacks transparency and patient control. More guidance is needed for these tech entities that are specifically new to the health space so that they can use health data to not only benefit patients, but also simultaneously hopefully benefit biomedical research efforts. And it's the hope that with sort of consensus-based guidelines, with significant input from the patient community, we can encourage and establish trust between patients, patient consumers, or what we would consider data contributors, and the companies that actually rely on the collection and aggregation and use of patient data. And lastly, this trusted system needs to benefit patients. It can't just take. Technology companies and researchers alike need to also trust these platforms, and there needs to be the development of applications that are actually co-created to provide safe, trusted spaces for patients, patient communities to come together to ethically share data in advancement of research, ultimately to find more cures. Next slide. So what can we achieve? What would success look like? So in our opinion, the health data ecosystem co-developed by patients for patients with patients in mind. Health data is flowing efficiently and used to accelerate research derive patient-led insights, and foster the development of products and cures to ultimately improve care. And that individuals feel that their health data is safe and trust the entities that hold it, while still maintaining control and ownership of their data, and that it will ultimately be used to benefit them and others like them. Next slide. And lastly, thank you all so much for having me part of this incredible panel. And for more information about envisioning a trusted system for health data, I'd encourage you all to read our most recent report from Faster Cures, a center of the Milken Institute. And please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Here is my contact information via email, and feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jan Geisler.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for introduction, Hadley, and thank you for inviting me to this presentation, to this session, which is really close to my heart. I mean, what I'm going to speak about is how can digital health become meaningful value to the patient community rather than serve the interest of other actors. And I'm going to pick up on a number of things that my previous speakers have actually talked about, like trusted systems that Hadley just touched upon, and aggregation without representation, which Andrea highlighted. I want to talk about, let's say, the opportunities of digital health, about interest, because there are vested interests everywhere, and also thinking a bit about a model where checks and balances could actually make sure that data generation digital health can really help us to achieve the goal of a more patient-centric design of services, of digital services. So next slide, please. I actually want to highlight, of course, that there are huge opportunities in digital health. And I wouldn't be there without digital technology, which already in the early 2000s actually saved my life to access clinical trials and information that I would have never gotten hold of in the offline world. And if we talk about research, and if we talk about digital health today, which has totally changed shape in the way we have it today, of course, patient engagement plays a huge role. If we think about technologies that can actually day to day, hour by hour, capture what we experience, capture what we think, capture what we need, and probably tell us what the community needs, it can actually help to really reflect the true needs and experience of patients at any time and any patient subgroup. And it can actually provide aggregated, valid information and evidence to everyone's fingertips, which might be the patient when they take decisions about themselves, which might be healthcare system providers, might be governmental institutions, might be researchers in industry and academia that actually base their decisions less on assumptions and more on evidence. But what we see, of course, also in digital, that we're often talking about recruitment or beta testing. So we are being invited in the digital app life cycle at a point when most of the things have been defined. And in that kind of whole power play that we see, very often the patient is just the consumer, just the recipient of services, or is just feeding into a system that serves the interest of different parties. While the objective should actually be to gather patient data to take better decisions, be it governmental decisions, research decisions, individual patient decisions, and so on. Next slide. And what I think is very important is to think about the timelines, because that's where the real clash is, because research in medicines and in healthcare actually has a 15-year life cycle or something like that, which I've highlighted here on the left side. It actually takes a long time to get a medicine to patients or any other intervention. While actually the, let's say, Silicon Valley style digital lifestyle, digital innovation cycle actually is a life cycle of always better. So 2 weeks later, you monitor, you improve, and it goes very quick actually to improve the services. And there's a whole clash in there between these multi-year cycles that we have in healthcare and the kind of digital technology that innovates very quickly. But the patient engagement principles that we have also developed in medicines development and R&D, like in EOPADI and PFMD, they should also apply to digital health. So how does that come together? How can we actually involve the patients and also think about checks and balances on the data we all generate? Next slide. And of course, in the patient community, we have seen that opinion doesn't matter. It's a very data-driven business, no matter whether we talk about regulation or industry or academic research, it's all data. And if evidence is king, evidence-based patient advocacy is King Kong. So we actually, as advocates, need to think about how we are not being disregarded just because we have an opinion, but how we bring data from our community to say what we're recommending in terms of service design, in terms of healthcare decisions, in terms of research design, and so on, is based on clear data and the right packaging that our recipient actually understands what we as patients really want. Next slide. And in that, we actually need to talk about legitimate interests, because everybody has interests. And as patient advocates, we're always being confronted that only industry has interests, and that is not true. Of course, we as patients and carers have personal goals of living a long life and a good life as long as possible. The patient organizations need to serve different populations of patient communities, different subgroups, age groups, stage groups of disease, and they need to represent the different needs of a very heterogeneous community towards all the different stakeholders. The academic researchers are also not just doing that for the good of mankind. They, of course, are interested in research questions. They're interested in good study design. And of course, they want their data published in high-tier publications, which of course gives attention to those that probably get into those publications. The physicians are very focused on best clinical outcomes, which might not necessarily be the best patient outcomes, because they might have different preferences, which might not always be clinical. And of course, sometimes physicians also want to keep a customer and not refer the patient to a study center, as an example. Industry, of course, has commercial goals undoubtedly, and they want to develop products that sell. Regulators have an objective of safety, efficacy, legal, market authorization, and payers have a responsibility towards societal health, but also to cost effectiveness and healthcare sustainability. And if we finally talk about healthcare startups, they start with a mission, often founded also by people which are really passionate. They accumulate data, but at a certain time, they go for a wealthy exit. And I'm going to speak about that in a second. So in all that kind of area of vested interests and also legitimate interests, because I don't want to say any of those interests are not legitimate, but how can we come to a model of digital health services that serves the patients first and then provide a value to everyone else's interests too? Next slide, please. So let's think about this. And of course, we are worried. I mean, in the previous talks in this session, we heard about some examples. And of course, the patient community has looked at with worry when patients like me was, let's say, sold to a Chinese investor, and then there was a big political hiccup. We actually made the company go back to the US. But in the end, it was all a big data deal. And the same happened to Health Unlocked, where the patient community, which actually sold to a company which is actually very focused on serving biopharmaceutical companies. And I mean, there are more than 500 patient advocacy groups in there and a lot of volunteers managing those communities. But in the end, they all do that as volunteers, while there's a huge big data business behind that. And whatever these kind of financial transactions mean, we need to think about what that means actually to patients, to their ownership and to their rights, and actually to, let's say, the attention which would serve them best. Next slide, please. So let's talk about some of the risks of digital. I called it controlomania and ownership. And you can probably see the hens on the right side, because everybody sits on the data like the hens on their eggs. And actually, there are a lot of data nests out there. And what we experience as patients, I mean, we're increasingly invited here and there, but at the same time, we are being communicated indirectly very clearly that who pays for the data actually claims the ownership and rules the game. So very often the traditionally generated data and the digital data is collected to support a hypothesis. So for example, to support the value of a product, not really measuring the potential patient-reported outcomes or adverse events that in long term may put the whole commercial story in question. We see the same things, of course, for governmental institutions, because they might aim to improve services or might generate data to restrict reimbursement or access to specific technologies because they feel they are either unnecessary or unaffordable. So there are interests in there. And that's why patient engagement, which is very fashionable, is often a claim, not a genuine aim. Because a frequent practice that we see is, even though they are huge patient organizations, very powerful, totally understaffed and under-resourced, but when it comes to patient engagement, the organizations that are doing research or doing governmental decisions, they are cherry-picking individuals to focus groups, convening their own ad boards, running their own surveys in a way that the generation of data actually supports the initial hypothesis that they have. So not raising the question, it's answering the question that they have. And that is then wrongly called patient engagement. Next slide, please. So from that perspective, I just want to raise the question, what kind of digital health model do we want? And I'm just trying to use the analogy of elephants and the mouse. And you can see the past model here. So that's how we feel sometimes, individual patients, part of a system, totally provider driven, and actually the big elephants, pharma, clinicians and authorities and other stakeholders actually decide what is best for the patients. That's the past. Click, please. Then now we got digital health, and that's one of my son's favorite comic, Elma. Silicon Valley and the app startups come in, and there's another elephant. And I think we've heard from Andrea before and also from previous speakers that this is the case. So in the end, the data might no longer be in pharma and might no longer be in authorities. They might be in Silicon Valley companies, but still no representation in these aggregation functions. Next slide, please. Well, our counter reaction as patient advocates is then play the mouse on the elephant. So the default advocacy model is like the typical model that I do is actually complain and trying to chase everyone around because we say, this is what we want. You're much bigger than I am, but I need to get you on the chair that we induce change. And that's, of course, not a good model because it's an emancipatory model. It's something just to focus on our rights instead of really being productive and making suggestions. And that's why we want to come to a different model, which I'm going to talk about now. Next slide, please. Because I think the future model for digital health must be a collaborative model where we don't cherry pick single patients for focus groups or as beta testers of digital services, where the patient community as such and the patient organizations that are, let's say, representative of institutions and organizations elected by their members that actually represent the needs of the patient community at the core. And they actually work with the clinicians, the pharma, the authorities in the Silicon Valley and the app startups to really tailor, to design, to implement, and to let's say, make the services used and also to govern the data that is coming out of such a system. Next slide, please. So if we think about how can we come to a model that actually describes what we need to change. And we thought long and hard about this, and it's still in infancy, but it's a bit of like what I call now 5I. So what are the guiding principles for good patient engagement in generation of health data? And I can't speak too much about the details of that because we don't have time. But if you just think about interests, everybody has legitimate interests, but the generation of data should not be aimed as just supporting a hypothesis of a single party. Then investment. Funding alone is not the investment. Patient organizations don't have funding, but they have knowledge, they have community insight, they have community outreach, they have knowledge, they have unique things, and there are many other things that everybody brings in. But at the moment, we are being faced that funding rules the game. And so we need to think, what is the decisive factor, and not funding alone, who owns the data, who sets research questions, who decides on methodology, who selects the patient population, who runs the analysis, and who does what with the conclusions from it. We need to talk about involvement because it needs a bit of a different structure than cherry picking individuals. the genuine objective is really to understand the wider population's needs, not individual opinions. Then if we talk about implementation, we need to talk about the appropriate use of methodologies. And we really need to have patient engagement all across, that these implementations happen with patients and with the governance of patients, reducing the risk of bias, coming back to the interest that we discussed in the beginning. And then, of course, in terms of impact, we always need to think about, one hand, how can the digital data actually help decision makers to take better decisions? But how can they also serve the patients? Because what we see digital services very often, that they generate decision support systems, but the only interface there is to support the doctor actually to understand all the different complexities of genomics. But is there a patient interface in there that the patient can also have a view on those kind of recommendations and conclusions? So this is really important. So let's think about impact, and also impact on individual patients when we think about those services. Next slide, please. So finally, we think a bit about data democracy, data to the people. And I think with GDPR, as much criticism as there is about GDPR, what it really wants to achieve, and look at Article 20, it says data to the patient, because it defines the right of citizens to data portability, because citizens using that right can obtain a machine readable copy of all their personal data, and they can actually transfer that or give others rights to that data and actually judge those rights. So from that perspective, I think patient organizations are the data custodians, acting as a data cooperative that enable all stakeholders on meaningful research without compromising patients' privacy. They can be the watchdogs, they can be the cooperative that enables good research that that ingests all different perspectives. Next slide, please. So how would that work? And I've actually taken that from Professor Ernst Hafen from ETH Zurich, because he's done a huge amount of work on data commons and data cooperatives. So how would that work? Patients are mandating the patient organization as a cooperative to collect the data, and also to act as a fiduciary with patient advocacy, academia, pharma, or healthcare system research. So they will make sure that everybody can access that anonymized data, pseudonymized data, to actually learn from the data that the patients are contributing to the cooperative. They will make sure that ownership and security are respected, and when patients want to withdraw their data, that they can. So you can actually see that model here. And I think that needs to be discussed more, but you can see a couple of Swiss examples, US examples, and so on these kind of data cooperatives that can act as a pilot. But the difference here is that the patient organizations are already there, so they can help. We can probably leapfrog some of the development, because there's already a democratic body, there's already an institution that can actually help to set this up in specific disease areas. So next slide, please. With that, I'm coming to the conclusion. And my open question to everyone is, are we ready for data to the patient, or is this yet another all about us, but just with a little bit about a little bit with us? So thinking about the summary, digital health brings huge opportunities to gathering data. And it's fantastic what is happening in terms of innovation, and with all the different things that we've been talking about in this session: telemonitoring, sensors, wearables, online communities, apps for almost everything. That's very dynamic, and we can learn from the rapid innovation cycles of the IT industry and the digital industry. The same principles of patient engagement, like in traditional data generation, may apply, and we've done a lot of work in PFMD and EU Party actually to think about this, but there are also new pitfalls. So that's why we need to think about these 5 I's to actually make sure there's fair use and fair application of all the principles when we generate data, and to make sure that they're not just serving other interests, but the patient is still the little mouse in the middle. That's why we need to think about new models of data generation, ownership, and portability, such as patient organizations. They can be acting as data cooperatives. Are you ready for it? And with that, I thank you so much for your attention. I now hope we can take this discussion further afterwards in Group Map, and afterwards in all the different forms that the Patient Engagement Open Forum offers. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jan. I'm totally ready for it on my side, and I think I'm not the only one. Having heard all the speakers, so thank you all the speakers. Really great to hear your perspective, and actually perspective that I don't think is the norm when we get out there and talk, you know, the usual digital health conferences. So I think very important to get this diverse perspective, but still bringing together some key points. The role of trust, which is the result at the end of efficient and trustworthy health systems and digital systems, the role of health literacy, the role of patients, the role of patient organization, the control they have, the collaborative environment. We had, I think it was Catherine suggesting that we jump on the elephant's back. The problem, Catherine, is that there are several elephants we have to jump on. So that's the collaborative environment is one of them. Share the data and make it meaningful for the patients, individual patient and the patient community. So we will now do two things for the next 20 minutes or nearly that we have before the end of this session. We'll pass the voice to you. The goal was to give you this kind of perspective we don't necessarily hear very often, which is very important if we want to progress on the digital health and patient engagement. We'll give the voice to you through Group Map. So it's an online tool. You will receive the link in the next slide. And we really recommend you to go through a computer. Keep the Zoom open. The goal is to exchange in Group Map, but we remain connected in the conference through Zoom. So you have the link on the screen. Please click there. And if we can go to the next slide. Next. So what we will do there is actually to give the voice to you, having heard this perspective, in the sense that we will ask you what you would like to see this year at PEOF, but also in between PEOF. So PFMD, but I know Opathy, from testing to targeted treatment initiative for the empowering the patients with a companion across the journey of the patient is one of the topics that Jan mentioned, and there is a project there. I'm sure FT3 will be in PEOF this year. So the idea is to ask you what you would like to do. So it's not only about putting a topic on the table, it's also what is the action next to that topic. And so on the screen right now, you have an example. We have the session coming just after in 16 minutes, which is about patient experience data. There is a link and an overlap with what we discussed right now. But so let's say the topic is patient experience data. And the challenge there is fragmentation and lack of alignment. The way we would like the idea to be seen in the Group Map tool is something around the line like 2021 goal would be to build clarity and structure regarding the conversation about patient experience data. So that's not just dumping a topic. No, just a little bit more information. If we can switch to Group Map, you can add one ID. So we have, to help analyze the results as they come, we have proposed a couple of categories of content. So the first four, and then the last one for other topics. So first four, like what are the good practices? Anything linked to the data model, anything linked to digital and health literacy, or guiding principle in digital health. And so as I see you coming in, so you can add one ID. So the goal of that is to make sure that you make sure that actually you don't duplicate ID that are already on the screen. And you can add what will be the most important thing for you. After that, if you want to help IDs to be actually prioritized moving forward, you can really like them. I see that the very first ID on the top left already has 24 likes, and so that makes it the first ID for that one. Don't forget, you can add one ID if something is missing, and I see it's coming as well. So please make sure you vote for all the IDs, or you like all the IDs as you get there. Now, as we populate that, and we will reflect on it moving forward, please make sure that you ask your questions, and the one that have not been replied, or anything that you would like to ask to the speakers. And me on my side, I would like to invite Charlie maybe to answer a question as the IDs are populated on the screen. So Charlie, you have this very specific profile where you have been actually looking at this issue from all the different perspectives. And when you hear Andrea, when you hear Jan and explaining the worries from the patient communities, and I know you discuss that as well with the patient you work with, how does that translate in your experience for the project you have been part of?
That's for me.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess the closest I come to the actual, well, apart from the family, is through the 100,000 genomes, through the participant panel. I mean, that's the key part for really engaging patients with how data is used, how data is protected, and how we can access data. And as I said in my talk, the function of these advisory, the function of the panels is to make sure that all of our different experiences, and they are very different, people can react in different ways to the same thing. So, for example, there was a Sunday Times article about the 100,000 genomes that stated that new genomics can fix you from birth. And to some people that was abhorrent because their rare disease might not be particularly poor, it might not be particularly severe. They wanted to live their lives as they were. But of course, there are other people who have really, really terrible diseases. This is very much a thing that they would like to fix. So there's a huge diversity of thought and opinion about what essentially, I guess, digital health can do. And it's important to bring all of those ideas through to the people who are making the decisions, and we do that via the participant panel.
Thank you, Charlie. And if I extend the question to Jan, and actually the question that was addressed to you in the chat about what should be addressed to adapt the medical research approach to digital. How would you respond to that question?
Well, I think there are a couple of factors. On one hand, we invest huge amounts of money into the data generation in a highly regulated framework throughout medicine's development until submission to market authorization. And we invest very little when actually those kind of therapies are going out in the field, and when we would actually need to know whether they perform in real life and in all the different subpopulations of patients in the same way like we hypothesized during the studies. And a lot of that has to do also not only with the clinical outcomes, but also with quality of life parameters and everyday parameters that you can measure by prone, can measure by apps, and can measure by sensors. So what we on one hand need to change is that paradigm after actually market authorization, that we have consistent ways to measure whether our promises are fulfilled. And the other thing is, of course, that we need to think about how can we make that life cycle quicker in terms of generating data and, let's say, getting access to these things. And of course, that's a question also we as patients need to answer, because there's no total safety with rapid approval and, let's say, the lack of very solid evidence. So how much uncertainty are we willing to take as patients to allow quick access and then broadening the group the more we learn about it? And are we also, let's say, prepared for withdrawing things if they don't perform And that's a question for you, for us as patients as well. So there's a lot of ethics, and I think these kind of questions can only solve with patients, because it's about our preference, it's about our safety net and our expectations of safety versus access, or safety versus benefit, and so on. So we need to be part of that conversation. And I can't see that we're really part of that conversation today, because we're largely left out from the regulatory discussions and also in the design discussions that need to take place to collect the data appropriately and answer the questions that patients have on that.
Thank you, Jan. And I will come back to your comment when I introduce the next session in a few minutes. On involving the patients in designing the data capture. I've seen a couple of comments regarding the engaging elderly patients and populations, and where we would put it. So just to acknowledge this comment and to say we are recording the chat, and we will actually process all the information, even the one we are not able to process. If we can maybe go to the top of each section to see which of the IDs are gathering most of the votes. Yes, in terms of the good practices, just looking at it from a patient journey perspective, from diagnostic to testing to treatment and long-term management, seems to be by far the first priority there. Also, in the second model, in the question about data model, so the top two are actually the first one. It's a shift from what was initially there. Actually, a data model for decision making, which is leading quite easily, but followed by the research data model, because when we talk digital, that's one of the digital is everything. It's really important to make sure what we are talking about. And the third one will be to actually keep the patients in the loop as we progress with what we do with this data. So the top three there. So yes, how can we work? And that's something I've learned as a best practice during the pandemic crisis this year. For everything related to remote clinical trials, actually, one of the best practices we could identify in the last 12 months was that by working with patients, the divide and the cause that could create that divide and the issues with remote trials, actually a lot of them could be anticipated and prevented because of the work with the patient. And so that's something really to see how can we extend that practice to all aspects. How can we work with patient engagement to address the digital and health literacy issues? So guiding principle in digital health. So transparency is a new one that came through this session. Articulate the patient's privacy and management principles. Something that I know there was some comment in the chat about GDPR in Europe only. I think maybe behind the GDPR laws, maybe the principle that have helped design GDPR could be actually articulated in some global guiding principle for digital health that we could actually apply, and maybe that could even become a quality label later on, but something we share to see what's the thinking behind GDPR and how we can turn that into something which is not legal, but could help many of the stakeholders apply these guiding principles. And in terms of the new topics, what about involving patients for all care and supports digital initiatives? That's clearly a place where we could apply all the good practices from involving patients in drug development. Diverse group is not enough. Understanding how cultural institutions form individual worldviews, even with diverse group, is critical. So making the link with the cultural aspect and institutions is quite important and got quite some votes. So that's a little bit, with the time I have, an overview of the top results here. I'm just checking the chat. Nothing has come very recently, and maybe, yes, I see the question from Angeliki, or the comment, which is about collaboration and synergies. And I think it was very well illustrated in Hadley and Jan's visuals, that actually putting the patient needs at the center would really help defragment health system as they are increased sharing and actually use data in a digital age where we connect data with the various stakeholders, because that's really, I think, one of the pitfalls of the approach so far, is actually we are not as connected and as sharing as we should be doing in a digital age. Now, we are coming to the end of this presentation. As mentioned, we are capturing all of this. We will shape the agenda moving forward with your IDs and sharing this content with the program committee of the Patient Engagement Open Forum, 16 people representing all stakeholder groups, and so 16 people from 16 organizations. So we will actually shape the next dates. We have another 6 dates this year where we will continue to discuss about digital health, and we will invite you to contribute to some projects that will be linked to these issues in between the sessions. Now, I would like to really thank all the speakers, and you can all switch on your camera so we can see you. So really a big thank you. I think this session was pretty unique by the fresh look, but also the confrontation with the system that you have helped us to face. I think it's really important to really make an acknowledgement of where we are and what we need to address to move forward. So thank you very much. I also would like to thank the team behind the screen. We have a lot of support in preparation. And so thank you very much to the team. It's really great to have you and to make it a success. And then we have, you will all receive a survey, a quick survey, that will be the survey you receive after each conference, except that this one, we actually insist on your opportunity to contribute and co-create. So feel free to help us. The format of the online software, the time allocated to discussion, the question you could ask or not ask, feel free to really insist on the co-creation. This is the main aspect of the Patient Engagement Open Forum. So feel free to help us improve it moving forward. Finally, the last point I wanted to do is to introduce the next session, patient engagement in patient experience data, and why we need patient experience data. We have a great panel with a clinician, regulator, industry, and patient organizations on the panel to again give a quite diverse perspective on this same question and see on how we can find the common ground. Thank you very much to everybody, and see you in the other session, I hope. Have a great day.